At only 17, a village girl hears a divine voice and leads the French army to victory. Her bravery inspires thousands, but her fate becomes a tragic sacrifice in the name of faith and freedom. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a name that echoes through the corridors of history, synonymous with unwavering conviction and extraordinary courage. In an age dominated by men, where a woman's place was far from the battlefield, she rose from obscurity to command an army, guided by what she believed to be the will of God. Her journey is a testament to the power of a single individual to alter the course of nations, a saga of faith, war, and martyrdom that continues to captivate the world centuries later. The story begins in the small, unassuming village of Domremy, nestled in the northeast of France, around the year 1412. Here a young peasant girl named Jean was born to Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Romy. Her childhood was ordinary, spent herding her father's sheep and learning piety and domestic skills from her mother. She was illiterate, like most commoners of her time, but her spirit was sharp, and her heart was devout. France was a kingdom in turmoil, fractured by the brutal, seemingly endless conflict known as the 100 Years' War against England. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled vast swaths of French territory, including Paris itself. The rightful French heir, the Dauphin Charles, was weak, uncrowned, and holed up south of the Loire River, his legitimacy questioned and his resolve wavering. The situation was desperate. The spirit of France was on the verge of being extinguished. It was in this climate of national despair that something extraordinary happened to the young girl from Domremy. Around the age of 13, Joan began to experience visions and hear voices. She identified them as Saint Michael the Archangel, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. At first, their messages were personal, urging her to be a good and pious girl. But as she grew older and the war intensified, the nature of these divine communications changed. The voices bestowed upon her a staggering mission. She was to save France. She was commanded to drive out the English, ensure the Dauphin's coronation at the traditional site of Reims, and restore the kingdom to its rightful ruler. For a poor, uneducated teenage girl, this was an unthinkable, impossible task. How could she, a nobody, accomplish what seasoned generals and noblemen had failed to do? For several years, Joan kept these revelations to herself, torn between fear and a growing sense of divine duty. The voices became more insistent, their commands more urgent. Finally, at the age of 16, she resolved to act. Her first step was to approach Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison commander in the nearby town of Uck. She presented her mission with a simple, unshakable certainty that was initially met with ridicule and dismissal. A peasant girl claiming to be sent by God to lead an army. It was ludicrous. He sent her away, telling her relatives to take her home and give her a good thrashing. But Joan was persistent. She returned, her conviction only deepening. She began to win over the local populace with her piety and the sheer force of her personality, even correctly predicting a French defeat at the Battle of the Herrings, a detail that lent supernatural weight to her claims. Her unwavering resolve eventually wore down Baudricourt's skepticism. Perhaps she was mad, but perhaps, just perhaps, she was the miracle France so desperately needed. He relented, granting her an escort to travel across dangerous, enemy-held territory to the Dauphin's court. Dressed in men's clothing for protection on the perilous journey, Joan of Arc arrived at the court of the Dauphin Charles in February 1429. Her arrival was met with deep suspicion. The court was a nest of intrigue and skepticism, and Charles himself was a cautious, indecisive man. To test her, he disguised himself among his courtiers. Yet, Joan, who had never seen him before, walked directly through the crowd and bowed before him, identifying the true Dauphin immediately. This act stunned the onlookers, but it was not enough. Charles subjected her to a lengthy and rigorous theological examination by a panel of high-ranking churchmen in Poitiers. 4 weeks, they questioned her, trying to find any hint of heresy or deception. But Joan answered their complex theological questions with a simple, disarming faith and sharp wit that left them confounded. Convinced of her sincerity and orthodoxy, and with little left to lose, Charles made a decision that would change history. He agreed to grant Joan command of an army. In late April 1429, the 17-year-old girl, now clad in a suit of custom-made white armor and riding a white horse, arrived at the besieged city of Orleans. The city had been under English siege for months and was on the brink of surrender. Its fall would have been a catastrophic blow, likely signaling the end of the French cause. The French commanders were weary and demoralized, their strategies ineffective. Joan's arrival was like a bolt of lightning. She brought not just a new strategy, but a new spirit. She was a symbol of divine hope, and her infectious courage revitalized the exhausted troops. She was not a commander in the traditional sense, giving tactical orders, but a spiritual and inspirational leader. She rode at the forefront of every assault, carrying her banner, which depicted God, Jesus, and Mary, instead of a sword. She urged the soldiers to confess their sins and put their faith in God, transforming a ragtag army into a righteous crusade. Within days of her arrival, the tide of the siege turned dramatically. Despite being wounded by an arrow, Joan refused to leave the field of battle, her presence inspiring a final furious assault that broke the English lines. On May 8th, 1429, the English abandoned the siege of Orleans. It was a stunning, miraculous victory. The Maid of Orleans, as she was now known, had accomplished in 9 days what the French army had failed to do in over 6 months. Her fame spread like wildfire across France. She was hailed as a savior, a living saint sent by God. The victory at Orleans was the crucial turning point in the 100 Years' War. It shattered the myth of English invincibility and breathed new life into the French war effort. Following this triumph, Joan led a whirlwind campaign along the Loire Valley, capturing key English strongholds one after another, clearing the path to Reims. The ultimate goal of Joan's divine mission was the coronation of Charles at Reims Cathedral, the traditional site where French kings had been crowned for centuries. This act would solidify his legitimacy as King Charles VII in the eyes of God and the people. Despite the reservations of his cautious advisors, Charles was persuaded by Joan's momentum and the string of victories. He agreed to the daring march through 100 miles of enemy territory. On July 17, 1429, with Joan of Arc standing proudly by his side, the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII in a magnificent ceremony at Reims. Joan had fulfilled the most crucial part of her divine mandate. She had given France a consecrated king, uniting the kingdom under a legitimate and sacred authority. It was the apex of her incredible journey. However, after the coronation, Joan's fortunes began to wane. The king and his court, now in a more secure position, favored diplomacy and negotiation over continued warfare, a strategy that clashed with Joan's divine directive to expel the English from all of France. Her subsequent military endeavors, including an ill-fated assault on Paris, were met with less success, partly due to the wavering support from the royal court. Her divine voices, she said, continued to urge her forward. But the political will to support her was faltering. In May 1430, during a skirmish outside the town of Campi, she was captured by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. The soldiers who pulled her from her horse had no idea of the immense value of their prize. She was sold to the English, who saw in her capture a golden opportunity, not just to eliminate a formidable military threat, but to discredit the very king she had crowned. The English put Joan on trial for heresy. This was a political trial disguised as a religious one. If they could prove she was a witch or a heretic, then her visions were demonic. Her victories were the work of the devil, and Charles VII's crown was illegitimate. The trial, held in the English stronghold of Rouen, was a legal travesty. It was overseen by pro-English clergy, led by Bishop Pierre. For months, the uneducated girl was pitted against a panel of learned theologians and lawyers who tried to trap her with complex legal and doctrinal questions. Yet, Joan displayed remarkable intelligence, courage, and wit. When asked if she was in God's grace, she famously replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." It was an answer so brilliant, it left the court speechless. Despite her brave defense, the verdict was a foregone conclusion. Under immense pressure and facing death by fire, she briefly signed a document of abjuration, confessing her sins. However, a few days later, she defiantly recanted, redonning male clothes, an act of relapse in the court's eyes that sealed her fate. On May 30th, 1431, Joan of Arc was taken to the marketplace in Rouen. At only 19 years old, the girl who would save France was tied to a tall stake. She asked for a cross to be held before her as the flames were lit. As the fire consumed her, her last word was a cry to Jesus. To ensure she was dead and to prevent the collection of relics, the English burned her body 2 more times, reducing it to ashes, which they then cast into the Seine River. They sought to erase her from memory, but in their cruelty, they immortalized her. Her death was not an end, but a transformation. Her martyrdom became a rallying cry for the French, who, inspired by her sacrifice, continued the fight with renewed vigor. Over the next 2 decades, they systematically drove the English out of France, ending the 100 Years' War and fulfilling her mission completely. Years later, in 1456, a posthumous retrial, authorized by the now-secure King Charles VII, officially declared Joan innocent of all charges and condemned the original trial as corrupt. Nearly 5 centuries after her death, in 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her, officially recognizing her as Saint Joan of Arc. Her bravery inspires thousands, but her fate becomes a tragic sacrifice in the name of faith and freedom.